Over 3,000 years ago, an uncontrollable storm swept through the surrounding areas. The once thriving Mediterranean cities have been reduced to ashes. Kingdoms, once hubs of trade and culture, perished one by one, as if had never existed. In the scant remaining records, one unsettling sentence surfaces often. Invaders from the sea. Who were they? The ancients dubbed them sea peoples, mysterious soldiers sailing unfamiliar ships, brandishing weapons no one had ever seen, speaking a language no one could understand. Nobody understood where they came from, but their entrance shook the entire. Strangely, even now, we know very little about them. Their roots remain, conceal their reasons. Unclear their genuine identity, and seemingly erased from history. All we know comes from the accounts of people who faced them, and civilizations that weathered the dread. They brought waves of migrants compelled to escape their failing homelands, savage bands of pirates, or an organized army committed on tearing down the global order of the moment. More than 3,000 years have passed, and the question remains unresolved. Archaeologists search for dispersed clues. Historians continue to dispute constantly, and perhaps, under the sands of time, the truth about the story of the Sea Peoples is one of the greatest mysteries in human history. An age they retreated into the depths of obscurity tonight. Join Bedtime History as we follow the trails of nameless ships, unknown warriors, and forgotten chapters of history to discover the story that has never been fully revealed. The story of the Sea Peoples, who they once were, and why their shadow still haunts humans. History to the present day. To understand why the entrance of the Sea Peoples caused such shockwaves through the old world, we must first understand what the Mediterranean looked like before the crisis. A world of connectivity. Between the 14th and early 13th centuries, there was both wealth and severe fragility. Centuries BCE, the Mediterranean and Near East entered an era of extraordinary development. Civilizations in the region were thriving not only economically and technologically, but also deeply, tied through huge networks of trade and diplomacy to Egypt's south. Thutmose III, Amenhotep III, and Seti I established a new empire under their reign. Standing at the height of its power, monumental temples emerged along the banks of the Nile, testifies to the king's enormous wealth and unbounded desire. Egyptian trade ships journeyed to faraway places, bringing home precious cedar, copper from Cyprus, rare stones, and unique spices from Lebanon. The fabled land of Punt to the north, over the Anatolian plateau. The Hittites. The empire evolved as a strong power from its well-fortified capital at Hattusa dominated major trade routes, linking the Near East with the Balkans. The Hittites were not only skilled fighters, but also expert diplomats, leaving enormous archives of diplomatic correspondence that expose a sophisticated realm of commerce and bargaining. To the Western Mycenaean civilization ruled the Greek mainland, with fortified cities such as Mycenae, Tirn, and Pios. These were formidable city-states capable of assembling enormous forces for their sophisticated metallurgy, and a privileged aristocracy who lived in luxurious. From Greece, Mycenaean commerce ships spread over the Mediterranean. To the east are the port cities of the Levant. Ugarit, Byblo, and Sidon were critical linkages in this regional trade. Ugarit, in particular, thrived as a lively center of commerce, culture, and it was here that the world's first real alphabet, which is the cornerstone of many current letters, was born. South, the territory of Canaan, which would eventually witness the development of new peoples, was an area filled with potential under the dominion of the great empires. Its citizens actively participated in coastal trade, supplied important items to broader markets. What bound all of these concentrations together were not only military power or money, but an extensive sea-spanning trading network, routes and overland caravans on big ships. Important goods, particularly archaeologists, have continuously transferred copper and tin to make bronze. Discovered shipwrecks like the Ulu Buran off the coast of modern-day Turkey. Its cargo was laden with riches from across. The ancient world was a striking monument to the strong economic interconnectedness of. However, this interdependence proved to be a fatal flaw, as trade routes were interrupted. When a single link in the chain was broken, the entire system might dissolve in a cascade catastrophe. However, many of these civilizations, outwardly powerful, were constructed on centralized and unstable structures of control, making them vulnerable to unexpected shocks. Nobody could have predicted that within a few short decades, an unknown, a force from across the water would rock the entire order to its core, unleashing one of the largest collapses in the history of human civilization. This world was centered on a complicated and far-reaching trade network, a mechanism on which every culture in the region relied, an unseen thread that linked their destiny together. Consider a ship leaving the port of Ugarit. On a quiet day, on its deck, barrels are filled with valuable copper. Is a valued metal mined in the island of Cyprus, which is known for its rich copper deposits. Alongside the copper are uncommon ingots of tin, possibly obtained from Anatolia, from more distant areas such as the Caucasus, or even the British Isles, locations that required long and dangerous trade journeys to provide their metals to the Mediterranean. The alloy of copper and tin bronze, the fundamental material for weapons, armor, tools, and even beautiful jewelry. Bronze would cause the armies and economics of the major empires to crumble, the lifeblood of the age. But this ship carried more than metals. Cedar logs from Lebanon's highland woods were also coveted wood, used to build warships and majestic castle beams. The elite's coffins contained gold from Nubia, and gemstones from Sinai, aromatic resins from the Arabian Peninsula, and a purple dye derived. Sea snails are highly prized by Eastern royal courts. Ships like this are connected: Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, Greece, and the Aegean Islands and Hattusa. The Hittites bought horses and tin, exported early iron items and exquisite textiles. In Mycenae, riches discovered in royal tombs reveal antiques from Cyprus, Egypt, and the Near East are examples of a lebly interconnected globe of trade. Each merchant and ship represented a tiny connection in this immense network. The network was not simply a conduit for goods, but also a freeway for ideas, technologies, faiths, and languages. The early Ugarit alphabets, advanced metallurgical methods, and even ancient myths spread over the sea with these commerce excursions. But this deep reliance also disappeared. These civilizations became more susceptible than ever when tin sources were stopped, when trade routes were disrupted by pirates or conflict. The implications included more than just the loss of a single commodity. When looking back on this period, it is possible that entire economic systems could crumble. We must miss the special contribution of the Bronze Age, which had constructed the "Why is the globe prosperous on the eve of the upcoming crisis?" Bronze. And why would an entire era rely so much on this single? At the time, iron had not yet been effectively smelted on a big scale. Bronze, a copper-tin alloy, was the strategic material of. It was used to manufacture swords, spears, arrowheads, and armor at the time. Bronze armies are crucial instruments for agriculture and construction. Lose their edge in warfare. Craftsmen could no longer make excellent items, and both trade and production would grind. A halt. But now comes the essential part. Copper and tin were not evenly distributed throughout the Mediterranean and Near East to provide a consistent supply. Civilizations had to construct extensive and sophisticated trade networks that passed through many hands. Intermediaries of copper was mined in Cyprus, Naetoanaera's major production hub. However, tin was considerably uncommon and had to be brought from distant locations. Some supplies came from Anatolia or mountainous areas to the east. Some experts even proposed that part of the tin supply moved from as far away as Central Europe or the British Isles via complicated and hazardous trading networks. For this reason, the great powers of the time were forced into mutual dependency to sustain their military and economic power. The single kingdom possessed all of the resources needed to exist independently from this shared system, creating a world where international links were not optional, they were required. Egypt's pharaohs maintained skilled diplomatic contacts with the Hittite kings. The Medinet city-states sought control over major sea routes. Cities like Ugarit became vital hubs. Merchants from all around the world gathered to trade commodities and share ideas. We know this. It's not only through archaeology, but also because to surviving diplomatic correspondence such. The clay tablets from Elmana and Ugarit depict monarchs offering one other gold, copper, horses, artisans, and even royal family members to strengthen ties. However, such strong dependence came at a double edge. If one link in the chain broke, a tin source ran dry, or a trade. When a route was stopped by war or piracy, the entire system was in danger of cascading. Modern researchers frequently relate the Bronze Age civilization to an early kind of global economy. And, like any global economy, it functioned efficiently when all elements worked in unison, but was dangerously vulnerable in the face of unexpected shocks. At the time, few could have predicted that such shocks were already stealthily building. And when they eventually struck the entire world order, the Bronze Age would disintegrate faster than anyone had ever dreamed conceivable. However, no matter how skilled the ancient monarchs were, and how big there were forces beyond human control, and the earliest hints of a commerce network, a developing problem began to emerge gradually from nature itself. Modern climate study combines data from old ice cores, tree ring studies, and lake bed sediments to provide. In the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE, the Mediterranean and nearby, the East endured a period of extreme climate instability, including prolonged droughts. Crops have been damaged, particularly in agriculture-dependent regions such tree ring studies from Canaan, the Levant, and even areas of Upper Egypt. Anatolia shows years of stunted growth and evident traces of protracted water. In addition, sediment layers from lakes in the Levant show sharply. Reduced rainfall cycles connect with periods of social upheaval, described in ancient scriptures in an economy that depended greatly on agricultural output and imported grain delivered over marine routes. The great kingdoms began to suffer increasing pressure. Food became scarce, prices skyrocketed, and hunger swept across the countryside. Regions that had long supplied warriors and laborers to the royal courts. Nature's vengeance didn't stop there. Powerful earthquakes are now confirmed by fault lines. Evidence and abrupt structural collapses at archaeological sites have struck down important cities. Ugarit, Hattusa, Mycenae, and many other centers show evidence of an earthquake. Walls collapsed just before or during waves of violent attacks. Storehouses were buried due to the power of the soil itself, not from fighting. Once gorgeous temples fell to ruins in a world where the king's authority was linked to his ability to protect his people from natural forces. Like disasters caused a significant psychological impact beyond the physical evidence. Surviving diplomatic letters also provide a vivid view into the spirit of the time. Clay tablets unearthed at Ugarit. We read frantic calls for help, stories of food shortages and civic upheaval, and streams of refugees escaping drought-stricken lands reveal a world crumbling from within, and an interdependent system that, once nature was pushed into disarray, we retain any sense of stability. Natural disasters hit, and societal tension simmered as the sea. People would emerge, but were they the cause of the collapse, or simply an unavoidable outcome of a world that is still unraveling that question today? Rhythm remains unanswered. However, the best picture of a world coming undone is not found in the cracks in the earth, but in the trembling phrases engraved on small clay tablets. Letters of desperation exchanged between kings are now discovered in the ruins. Ugarit was a bustling trading center on the coast of the Levant, serves as an important junction in the region's economic network. The city was not just wealthy, but also well advanced in administration and writing. Archaeologists have discovered more than 1,000 inscribed clay tablets document commerce, treaties, and diplomatic correspondence. Among these are letters that still send shivers down the spine when read today. The king of Ugarit wrote a message to the king of Cyprus as enemy armies closed in. Says the enemy is at the gates. My city is in dire straits. Send reinforcements and food it quickly if possible. Otherwise, I fear that Garrett will be unable to hold out. Those simple, desperate words depict a world once accustomed to trade, The diplomatic formality is suddenly thrown into a war for survival. In one dispatch to the king of Alatia, Cyprus, the monarch of Ugarit revealed the disruption of the commerce system itself, claims that trade ships can't dock because weird pirates have appeared off the coast, and regrets that copper and tin, which were formerly routinely delivered, failed to arrive when taken together. These scattered details depict a regional economy that formerly ran well, now grinding to a standstill, and as commerce routes broke down military and food, supplies across the kingdoms immediately sank into turmoil. What is particularly noteworthy about these letters vary with time. In early tablets, one sees polite greetings, invitations to exchange presents, royal wedding discussions, all expressing a Ugarit's final letters reveal a world of confident, rich kings, written just before the city was destroyed. That confidence is gone. Place frantic begs for aid, and raw dread kings, who once envisioned themselves at the pinnacle of power, were driven to writing frantic appeals, as vulnerable as any commoner. And then one day, Ugarit fell. When archaeologists discovered these tablets, several were still resting on the writing tables, never dispatched. Those last, undeliverable letters remain a striking reminder to a world disintegrating. We may still sense the breath of a dying period through a line pressed into clay. At this point, the Sea Peoples began to emerge from the shadows as agents, or possibly as emblems of the end. It is difficult to imagine that only a few years ago, those urgent cries were quickly etched onto clay tablets, while the towns of the Mediterranean were still basking in. Ugarit, for example, was not in an atmosphere of unusual affluence and opulence, only a bustling seaport, but also an important cultural center in the majestic residences of merchants and nobles. Excellent ceramics, gold and silver jewelry, and ingeniously carved sculptures were placed everywhere, indicating a privileged class that valued beauty and spared no effort in decorating their lives. Merchant ships came and passed, the waterfront in a continual flow. The stalls were bustling with silk spices, colorful glass and precious metals from all over the world on the walls. Artists presented depictions of gods and old narratives. Their art reflected a Hattusa. The Hittite Myanmar's capital had a dynamic and self-assured culture, less impressive. Its temples and enormous gates were made from massive stone. In the palaces, scribes painstakingly recorded blocks with exquisite sculptures, treaties, and momentous events, as if time and history were under their command. To the west, in the Mycenaean city-states, the aristocracy's life revolved. Huge palaces where colorful frescoes covered the walls, depicting hunting scenes, rites, and hazardous maritime journeys. Mycenaean troops dressed in brilliant bronze armor paraded in festivals, proudly commemorating the strength and traditions of their people. Even ordinary residents who were not wealthy people benefited from this prosperous, internationally connected economy. Finer fabrics, used superior domestic products, and had access to luxury stuff. Once reserved for the elite in religious rituals, serious processions remained. As usual, priests offered the greatest commodities to the gods, not only to seek blessings, but also to display their city's wealth and power. Most importantly, people most likely felt a tremendous faith in the stability of their world. The Order Kings proudly engraved their conquests and distant treaties into stone. Merchants gladly invested in long sea trips. People lived with the belief no one expected that their universe, in all its complexity and grandeur, would continue for years to come. That in just a few short years, all would be burned to ash. Mighty fortifications would burn trade. Routes would be disconnected. The cheerful sounds of festivals would be replaced by desperate cries resounding over the land. And as we read those final letters, today, if we stand among the ruins of Mycenae or Hattusa, we can observe more than broken stone and shattered buildings. We experience a deep and lingering regret for a world that once shone with confidence and life, but now reduced to little more than faint echoes of a bygone past. In the spectacular scene we've just painted, the first profound undercurrents began to stir, a huge conflict, but through words engraved in stone, like a faint warning from the first recorded record of the Sea Peoples comes from the magnificent stone monument The Menipta Stilele, or the Victory Stele of Muptar, was constructed around 1207 BCE CE in Egypt. Pharaoh Mipar, son of Ramesses Zesta. Egypt faced rising threats on both its western and eastern borders. Inscriptions commemorating his achievements with stories of successes over the Libu and Meshu tribes in the west. There is a seemingly little element that might open the door to one of the greatest mysteries of ancient history. The inscription reads, Yanhikan has been plundered, Ashkelon has been captured, Giza has been grabbed, Yanovam has ended, Israel's seed is no more, and the Shurdan, Shalish, Ekwesh, Luka, Toatel, who arrived from the distant sea, have been defeated, no longer a menace to the land of Egypt. These names, Sharon, Shelesh, Ekwesh, Luka, and Teres, would eventually offer important clues as we trace the passage of the. What distinguishes out is how these groupings are represented as having originated from the water. The word distant sea is both specific and mysterious. Earlier Egyptian records had ever described these peoples, who did not belong to the conventional powers of Egypt, was accustomed to confronting modern researchers, assume they were nomadic groups or warrior coalitions coming for the first time on the historical scene, just as climate and social changes were intensifying. It's also worth mentioning that Egyptian monarchs were quite precise about how they chronicled their victories. These mysterious groups from the sea were referenced in an official inscription, such as the Mipara stele. The wars with them were severe enough to earn inclusion in the annals of history, indicating that the sea people's presence was no longer a trivial event. Additionally, the mention of Canaanite cities being destroyed in the same text implies that these seaborne tribes were not merely clashed with Egypt, but were also impacting the whole Mediterranean area, where delicate commercial systems and political ties were already under strain. Even the great pharaohs can feel a new wave of instability coming. Could not ignore, and as we will see, this was only the beginning. In the years to follow, these groups would not be limited. They would organize into massive migratory forces in response to coastal incursions, bringing with them families, women, children, and their wealth, pushing deep into fertile fields and changing whole political and economic landscape of the region for the century that followed. What was chiseled into the Miptar stele still echoes to us across time. A world that once appeared unbreakable was on the verge of its biggest upheaval. If the inscriptions on the Muptar stele were the first warning of the Sea People's coming, and less than 3 decades later, the entire Egyptian world would face the full force of the storm they unleashed around 1175 BCE. During the reign of Pharaoh Ramesses III, Egypt engaged in one of its most brutal battles throughout its history, a fight we can vividly imagine today because of the comprehensive reliefs carved on the walls of the Medinet Habu temple in Thebes. These images are more than 3,000 years old, are still sharp and stunning as if etched only yesterday, and among them, we clearly sense a great force from across the sea had arrived, bringing not only warriors, but entire migrating groups of women, children, wagons laden with things, as if they planned not just to pillage, but to seize new lands for themselves. According to Rome III, this coalition of sea peoples includes various groups, including the Peliset Cheka, Shecheshten, and Wes, names that are still the topic of intense scholarly dispute today, as researchers continue to look for their actual origins. The reliefs depict well-equipped maritime fleets with massive armored ships and broad sails. Their warriors wore unusual horned or conical helmets, hold round shields, and wield unusual weapons, convincing proof that they were not undisciplined raiders, but a force intentionally planned for large-scale conflict. Ramesses III anticipated this confrontation. He stationed ambush forces. Egyptian warships were stationed around the beaches and across the Nile branches and river mouths. Important choke points. When the conflict began, sea peoples would need to cross to push interior. People's ships became caught in shallow waters, making them ideal targets for Egyptian archers and infantry on both sides. The carved figures depict the sea peoples fighting ferociously, but also portray victims floating in the river, ruined ships, and captured migrants. In the Inscriptions, Ramesses III boasts of a resounding triumph over those who came from the sea. I toss them back into the sea, and they lie scattered on the dunes. Phrase home. But behind these triumphal words lurks an indisputable fact, not a petty attack. It was a frantic large-scale exodus, a fight between Egypt and a vast flood of displaced peoples seek resettlement rather than. Despite Ramses III's proclamation of triumph, Egypt was not. Left unaffected Egyptian lands in the Levant that had long been under Egyptian influence. After the crisis, Egypt's international power was irrevocably significantly weakened, and the domestic economy suffered considerably in the aftermath of the war, and this was only one. While Egypt was able to keep some of, many other kingdoms were not as lucky. The sea's tide continued to sweep across the Mediterranean, leaving scorched cities and shattered civilizations. When we look at the reliefs at Medinet Habu today, we witness more than simply conflict scenes. Witness a critical turning point in history, where an ancient world began to vanish, and a new unstable and chaotic order emerged from as historians examine the remaining documents of Mayor Neptistel from the reliefs at Medinet Habu and from numerous scattered literary sources, identified a list of names closely related with the Sea Peoples. These include the Sharon, Shalish, Peliset, Cheka, Denion, and Luca names. These are both weird and unsettling. Each raises unresolved questions. What is most amazing is that the Sea Peoples have not written a single text. Nobody has ever discovered themselves. Everything we know about them comes from the chronicles of those who fought against them, primarily Egypt, a civilization with a lengthy history of meticulously recording its military confrontations. Sheridan frequently defined these groups as great soldiers who were distinguished by some researchers say they may have horned helmets, magnificent armor, and round shields, have connections to the island of Sardinia, where old cultural remnants reveal intriguing, similar, but the evidence remains unclear. The true roots of the Sheridan remains a mystery, whereas Shields is a name that suggests possible ties to Sicily. However, like with the Sharon, this connection is speculative and based primarily on language similarities. No definitive archaeological evidence has yet linked them to the island Peliset. Perhaps many historians feel that the organization has the clearest historical footprint. Peliset were the forefathers of the Philistines, who eventually settled along the coast of Canaan and established towns such as. Archaeological evidence from Gaza and Ashdod indicates that the emergence of a new civilization in this region, with significant Aean elements, substantially different from the native Canaanite culture. Checker is another group that settled in the Levant, leaving remnants in the vicinity of Dor, but their original homeland is nobody knows where they originated from before. To joining the Sea People, migrations Denian is possibly the most contentious name. Some academics link them to the Danawi, an ancient Greek word for the Mycenaeans. Among the Sea Peoples were populations originating from Greece. However, this remains a theory. Luca is frequently associated with the region of Lycia in Anatolia, which has a long history of sailing and piracy. But were the Luca mentioned in Egyptian texts actually the same as the Lycian people known from later times? That question remains unanswered. The common thread across all these names is that we don't know where they genuinely came from. No ancient map records, a kingdom of the Sheridan region of the Danaan. No city claims to have been the original homeland of the Peliset previously. Since their arrival in Canaan, no written account from these people has ever discovered, making the Sea Peoples an exceedingly elusive occurrence. They were autonomous groups of peoples who got together due to circumstance. They are an organized confederation with a shared aim of migration. Historians have no definite answer to the question of conquering to this day. This ambiguity assures that the narrative of the Sea Peoples will always retain the air of an unresolved mystery, a true piece of forbidden history at the heart of ancient world, but maybe what left the deepest imprint of the Sea Peoples, both upon the ancient civilizations they encountered and upon us now, were not only their mystery names, but their spectacular warrior images retained. The reliefs, most notably on the walls of the Medinet Habu temple, throughout the temple's colonnades, Spectacular conflict scenarios unfold before the sight. Egyptian soldiers confront strange warriors from across the sea, unlike their typical adversaries, such as the Libu or the Canaanites' most distinguishing feature is their headwear. Many sea peoples, warriors are portrayed sporting helmets with two sharp horns, or at times, wide-brimmed helmets with a towering projecting crest are a form not seen in Egyptian or adjacent military traditions. These helmets were not only practical, they appear to have carried symbolic meaning, may symbolize strength or distinct cultural identity. This single detail has provoked decades of discussion among historians and archaeologists. Were these ceremonial helmets designated for leaders? Reflect a characteristic warrior tradition shared throughout diverse sea peoples' cultures, and we observe them carrying circular shields, some convex, others flat, often with a metal boss at the center is designed to block strikes or be utilized offensively. Or in close combat, the sort of shield was prevalent in the Aean and Anatolian worlds, but largely foreign to Egyptian soldiers. In terms of weaponry, sea peoples often preferred long oval or rectangular shields. Some reliefs show soldiers with short, double-edged swords, huge daggers, and occasionally throwing spears. Depict them with leaf-shaped swords, which are surprisingly similar to weaponry unearthed at Mycenaean archaeological sites. This emphasizes the notion of potential ties between the sea peoples and Aean cultures. Additionally, their dress, stunning. Many warriors are pictured wearing short fringed skirts with bare legs, light footwear. This outfit allowed for agile movement, suitable for fighting on board ships or executing fast coastal landings, developed an image of soldiers who were unknown and formidable. Egyptians were well versed in the weapons and tactics of their ancient opponents. Sea peoples must have seemed foreign and extremely threatening, and it was precisely this distinction that strengthened the notion that they came from distant regions, bringing with them separate military legacy that is not fully integrated into the coastal civilizations. Today, archaeologists continue to compare. Artifacts discovered in Sardinia, Sicily, depict warrior images of sea peoples, Lycia and Mycenaean. Greece have yet to make any clear conclusions. Every detail, the horned helmets, the round shields, the unfamiliar swords, remains a dispersed puzzle piece in a portrait that has yet to be full when we look at the reliefs of Medinet Habu and the inscriptions of the Meniptar. One thing becomes clear. The sea peoples were more than just passing shadows. Throughout history, they were a force strong enough to be memorialized, Egyptian stone, and abundant enough to cause one of the greatest crises of the late Bronze Age. But who were they? This is one of the questions that historians have been arguing for over a century. Two basic hypotheses have developed. Were they merely brave gangs of pirates, or were they part of a more organized wave of migration that helped plunge? The initial hypothesis of piracy is anchored on the turmoil of the entire Mediterranean. Egyptian scriptures depict their first encounters with the sea peoples. Hasty attacks from fast-moving ships, unexpected raids along the coast, robbing and withdrawing quickly, blended well with the form of organized piracy that was already prevalent throughout the Mediterranean during. Furthermore, clans such as the Luca connected to Lycia, an area long connected with maritime warriors and piracy, appear to support this view. However, if they were pirates, why do the reliefs portray women, children, and entire migration groups? Why during the main invasion under Ramesses III did the sea peoples bring wagons loaded with belongings, cattle, and tents are evident evidence of migration? This detail opens the door to the second theory, which is now embraced by many current experts. The sea peoples represented a coordinated wave of migration, resulting from great disruption across the ancient world. Climate crisis, extended droughts, severe earthquakes, and the breakdown of trade networks, formerly productive areas, into harsh, unsustainable ecosystems. In this context, groups from heavily devastated regions, possibly from Anatolia, the Aeans, or even further west, were forced to evacuate their homelands, transporting their entire villages in quest of fresh sites to settle. Migrations, when met with resistance from established civilizations, can easily turn violent, converting into wars. Raids may be how the Sea Peoples carved their place in history, not just as pirates, but as desperate, resolute groups eager to battle for their future. The matter remains open. The Sea Peoples may not fit. They could have been a combination of several, various organizations, including pirates, migrants, and professional warriors. The Sea Peoples are so elusive and intricate because of their diversity, fascinating for anyone interested to the deeper mysteries of ancient history. To really comprehend their essence, we must explore and sift through every notion, archaeological clues, and analyze every remaining text. A trip that is deeper. We discover that some portions of history are still not ready to give up their secrets. Debates about the true nature of the Sea Peoples may continue, but the repercussions they left behind are evident, and the city of Ugarit remains as possibly the most dramatic witness to their impact. Located on the northern shore of the Levant in what is now modern-day Syria, Ugarit was one of the biggest commercial centers of the Bronze Age. From here, Ugarit's merchant ships went across the Mediterranean, trading copper tin and cedarwood-colored glass, beautiful fabrics, and numerous more luxury things. The Ugar alphabet, one of humanity's most advanced. The oldest writing systems were created here, laying the groundwork for Phoenician script, and ultimately for many of the world's alphabets. Ugarit's palace was large and housed hundreds of clay tablets chronicling commercial and diplomatic activities, treaties and royal correspondence documents that have significantly enhanced modern historians comprehend the region's political and economic landscape on the eve of the Sea Peoples. But all that changed in a couple of moments. The final letters of the ruler of Ugarit, as we already seen, plainly depict the city's mounting panic, as enemy forces believed to be the Sea Peoples closed in, followed by Ugarit, disappeared from history. Modern excavations at the site of Ras Shamra, where Ugarit once stood, shows a layer of ash and debris blanketing. The entire city walls fell, brickwork charred with fire. Clay tablets. What is most apparent is the lack of evidence that Ugarit was ever rebuilt. There were no new strata of settlement, and no traces of recovery. The previously prosperous city was abandoned forever following the attack. Archaeologists discovered many unfinished clay tablets in kilns, an indication that the onslaught struck too quickly for artists to complete their work. Diplomatic letters were found still laying on writing tables, never dispatched. This demonstrates the severity with which Ugarit was destroyed, as well as, with the collapse of Ugarit, a connection in the Mediterranean commerce network was lost. As that link crumbled, the entire linked regional economy shivered in response. Today, when we look at Ugar's burnt walls and the fractured fragments of its clay tablets, we cannot help but feel a tremendous sense of loss. A center of affluence, civilization, and creativity were obliterated in an instant from the flow of history as if it had never existed. And Ugarit, was just one of the many casualties the Sea Peoples tide, a wave that continued to rush across the Mediterranean globe. If the destruction of Ugarit exposed the terrible power the Sea Peoples might unleash onto coastal commerce cities, the story of Hattusa, the mighty capital of the Hittite Empire, begins an even more terrifying. And Hattusa was previously located deep within the Anatolian plateau. The Hittite was one of the biggest superpowers of the Bronze Age. The empire not only governed enormous regions spanning from Anatolia to the Levant, but it also served as Egypt's. The city of Hattusa was created as the primary adversary in international treaties and battle, spanning a broad region guarded by enormous stone walls, monumentally sculpted. Archaeologists discovered gates and beautiful royal mansions in its archives. More than 30,000 clay tablets chronicle all aspects of Hittite life, law, diplomacy, religion, and war followed approximately 200 to 1190 BC. Hattusa was abruptly abandoned. Archaeological investigations indicate broad traces of damage and fire across the city. But here is the mystery. There is no concrete evidence that Hattusa was attacked by Sea Peoples, and no Egyptian records mention this. However, the timing of Hattusa's abandonment is too striking to overlook. Occurred precisely at the time when the Sea Peoples were sweeping over the Mediterranean as the worldwide system of alliances and trade collapsed all around them. Scholars think that after damaging coastal communities, the Sea Peoples may have indirectly caused internal turmoil within the already weakened Hittite Empire, an empire reeling from climate, crisis, drought, and confrontations with mountain tribes. The final royal letters. The Hittite archives include a desperate tone filled with cries for rescue, made from the Hittite ruler to vassals and allies, disturbingly identical to the final messages from Ugarit that we encountered. Previously, it is established that Hattusa was never reconstructed following its abandonment. The Hittite Empire, once an equal to Egypt, vanished. Historical map. Leading to an era of anarchy in which minor kingdoms, migrating peoples came to control much of Anatolia. What happened in Hattusa's? In the closing days, did the Sea Peoples attack the city directly? Or did the disintegration of trade networks and the development of instability have had an emotive influence on the empire? No one can declare for certain that the crisis is irreversible. The timing, along with evidence of disrupted trade linkages and a widening wave of collapse, suggests that the shadow of Sea Peoples undoubtedly loomed over the end of Hattusa, whether via force and that darkness would continue to grow as we followed their path to other towns of the dying. Hattusa remained motionless amid its ashes in the Bronze Age world. The tide of crises did not stop in Anatolia, but spread westward throughout the Iron Sea and struck the very center of the Mycenaean realm, the Greek culture of the Bronze Age. The Mycenaean civilization was known for its towns. Mycenae Pios, tyrants and thieves, was one of the Aeon's most powerful commercial and military forces. Its fortified mansions, towering cyclopean walls, and the numerous valuables uncovered in royal tombs reflect a culture that was both prosperous and the sophisticated Mycenaean system of power, based around large palace complexes, where the king, Bonax, controlled the economy, military, religious rites, and diplomacy. Their trading routes stretched over the Mediterranean, exchanging products with Egypt, Levant, and Anatolia. However, from the late 13th to early 12th centuries BCE, one Minian city after another began to fall near Mycenae, where excavations indicate vast layers of ash, covering architectural remnants, evident traces of a massive citywide fire. Granaries, armories, and residential quarters all show indications of simultaneous devastation. Pios, one of the greatest administrative cities of the Minian world, had a similar destiny. The palace of Nestor's clay administrative tablets were hardened in the blaze this is why archaeologists can still read them now. However, one of the final tablets contain orders to mobilize defensive soldiers and ready warships, suggesting that the invasion came quickly as the city was still organizing themselves. Defenses at Tyrants, one of the strongest Mycenaean castles. We locate more of. The entire palace system previously had collapsed walls and burnt buildings. The backbone of Mycenaean power fell within a few decades. Surprisingly, there are no traces of long-term restoration at these locations. The Mycenaean civilization is so dependent on, some experts suggest that the complicated palace network was unable to restore. Internal instability or revolt may have caused the destruction. But when compare the timing of the sea's expeditions across the Levant, Egypt, and while considering the royal Mycenaean, according to records on naval defenses, many assume that the Sea Peoples played a significant influence in the collapse, either directly or indirectly. Furthermore, in the aftermath of this annihilation, the entire Mycenaean world fell into a severe collapse. The script used by the ruling class vanished. International trade collapsed. City-states disintegrated, retreating into isolated, smaller towns. This vacuum marked the beginning of Greece's so-called Dark Age, which would last for millennia before the Greek world awoke anew in the archaic and classical periods. As we see the burnt walls and scorched tablets of Pios or Mycenae, today, it is difficult not to cringe. A civilization that once ruled the Aeon, which had challenged the major kingdoms of the mainland, crumbled. The stately palace system that marked its dominance was destroyed in a blaze of fire. Though the Sea Peoples are not often explicitly named in Greek texts, their shadow remains an inexorable wave that swept across all in its path. As the Mycenaean civilization faded, the Sea Peoples left markings over the Aegean to the east, in the country of Canaan, that would be even more permanent than material ruin. Deep its demographic and cultural changes that can still be evident today, stretching from the southern coast of the Levant, northward toward Byblo, was formerly a rich region. Its cities, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gaza, and Giza were thriving commercial cities for the Canaanites, created a flourishing culture by dealing significantly with Egypt, Hittites, and Mycenaeans, operating as middlemen throughout many of the Mediterranean's important maritime routes. However, by the late 13th century BC, archaeological evidence indicates that a huge wave of change rushed through the region, most notably the sea. The people that settled here were the Peliset, a population that current researchers nearly unanimously identify as the forebears of the Philistines famed in later history. The reliefs at Medinet, Habu depict the Peliset as one of the key forces in the Sea People's invasion on Egypt. However, unlike some other, the Peliset were not fully exterminated. After their defeat in Egypt, some of them formed a permanent settlements in the coastal lands of Canaan. Excavations at locations such as Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gaza exhibit a fresh stratum of habitation appearing dramatically around 1200 BCE, coincided nicely with the Sea People's migrations. What is remarkable is that the material culture of this new layer is significantly unlike the local Canaanites. The pottery styles reflect late Medinet or Rhegian traditions, architectural features, burial rituals, and culinary trends lead to this group would later be known as the seafaring people. The Hebrew Bible portrays the Philistines as significant foes of the Israelites. The Peliset settlement in Canaan did more than simply upset the regional equilibrium. It transformed the demographic Mycenae of the Levant, but the Canaanites did not perish. But in many coastal locations, they were supplanted or eventually assimilated by these new settlers. Evidence reveals that the Philistines rapidly constructed a powerful economy, restored trading networks, and formed a distinctive cultural identity, mixing their deep marine roots with local impacts. This reveals a crucial feature of the Sea People's movements. They were not only agents of destruction, they were also builders. Some groups opted to settle and adapt, contribute to the cultural fabric of the nations they entered, creating markings that would linger for millennia. The towns of the Mycenaeans fell, and Hattusa and Ugarit became ruins. A new chapter was emerging in Canaan, one that the Sea Peoples, through the Peliset, authored with their actual presence. However, probably the most profound impact of the Sea People's wave of the collapse of a network was what caused catastrophe, not the burning of towns. The sophisticated trading system that once linked the whole ancient world of the Bronze Age, now fractured beyond repair for nearly 2 centuries. Civilizations throughout the Mediterranean had developed a budding global economy. Extensive sea and overland trading channels linked Egypt to the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, Ugarit, Canaan, Cyprus, Anatolia, and even regions beyond copper. Tin, the lifeblood of the Bronze Age, also ran via this system. Came cedarwood, gold, silver, ivory, precious stones, beautiful fabrics, wine oil, numerous other rare and precious products. Merchant ships loaded with cargo formerly sailed over the Mediterranean as shuttles, weaving a huge economic network, preserving the sophisticated palace economies of Egypt, Hittites, and Mycenaeans, humming smoothly. But within a few decades, that network crumbled completely. The warships of the Sea Peoples blocked or interrupted coastal trade routes. Once thriving port cities, such as Ugarit, have been reduced to rubble. The port of Byblo fell into decline. Alashia, contemporary Cyprus, an important supply of copper was attacked. The flow of copper and tin was disrupted by the absence of merchant vessels necessary for the production of weapons and tools came to a standstill, a domino effect without the Bronze Palace. Economies crumbled and could not be maintained. Military strength or retain their elite hierarchies. Clay tablets from Ugarit. Pios reveals that even as devastation approached, city officials were feverishly scrambling to organize convoys, beg assistance, and organize their naval forces. But it was all for naught. Paths had become too insecure, and the old world swiftly collapsed from order to anarchy. International alliances collapsed, diplomatic accords that were once set in stone as partners either no longer existed or eternal pledges became worthless, lacked the strength to fulfill their commitments. A system that relied on a constant supply of foreign commodities could not survive. Without trade, palaces collapse, aristocrats lose power, and artisans. Unemployment prompted some to return to subsistence living. Roads that were once bustling with business were silent, and warehouses that were formerly overflowing with products stood empty. Docks that had formerly echoed with traders' shouts. Many historians are left with decaying walls and lonely old mooring posts. Describe this collapse as one of the first evidence of the failure of globalization. A world, once closely interwoven and seemingly stable, revealed to be startlingly frail in the face of unexpected upheaval. And when the dust eventually settled, the Mediterranean globe, a new order, fragmented, regional, and unclear, developed in its place, ushering in a dark era that will take generations for humanity to recover from as the Mediterranean world slid into turmoil. The question, the genuine origins of the Sea Peoples, become increasingly important for current academics. One of the most popular explanations is that a portion of the Mycenaean population, after their civilization collapsed, they became part of the Sea Peoples wave, traveling and plundering across the Mediterranean. This argument stems from several striking observations. First, we have observed between around 800 and 1150 CEE, the huge Mycenaean palace cities. The power structure disintegrated, and the aristocracy was gone. Its foundation and many communities were suddenly cut off from the imported food and products they had once relied on. In order to survive in this climate, many Mycenaean groups were compelled to leave their former centers. Archaeological evidence suggests that after the palace system crumbled, the population in the Peloponnesian plains plummeted dramatically. Many coastal areas and Aegean islands, which were once thriving, were abandoned simultaneously. In new places like the Levantine coast, a new layer of habitation emerged, showing clear Aegean cultural characteristics, particularly in ceramic forms. The name Denian also appears in architectural methods and burial rituals. The sea's lists may be linked to Danawi, a phrase later employed by the Greeks. Many scholars have argued that they use themselves to characterize the Mycenaean people. Some displaced Mycenaeans, rather than waiting to perish, combined with other maritime groups to establish armed migrant gangs, fought and sought new areas. However, this theory faces significant hurdles. First, there is no direct proof that the Sea Peoples who raided Egypt spoke Greek or wore the distinguishing insignia of. Second, there existed cultural variation among the Sea Peoples, ranging from the horned helmets of the Sheridan to the round shields of the Peliset, to armament and dress styles that differed widely between groups. This shows that if the Mycenaeans they were only one aspect of a far more intricate alliance, not the dominating one. Furthermore, archaeology in Greece demonstrates that some Mycenaean communities persisted after the crisis, particularly in rural areas and on islands. If the entire Mycenaean warrior class had converted into Sea People, such great cultural continuity within Greece may not have been as apparent. Finally, several researchers warn that comparing the Sea Peoples to the Mycenaeans risks oversimplifying what was. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Sea Peoples consisted of a variety of groups, from Anatolia, the Balkans, the Aegean, and the Levant. Displaced Mycenaeans contributed to the Sea Peoples wave is widely supported. It also contains gaps and uncertainties, which are precisely these lingering mysteries that continue to feed the eternal interest around the Sea Peoples. A chapter of history that the further we research, it reminds us that certain answers may still lie just beyond our reach. Uncover the true nature of the Sea Peoples. A second main theory has garnered substantial interest from today. Scholars may have related part of the Sea Peoples' wave to migration. Balkan people, mainly Dorian tribes, moved southward throughout. During the crisis, this theory is based on observations from both archaeology and current genetic studies. According to scholars, in late migration from the northern Balkans around the 13th and early 12th centuries BC began moving south in earnest. Archaeological evidence suggests that several villages in the Danube Valley, major upheavals occurred throughout the Balkans, most likely due to harsh climate shifts, demographic pressures, or internal conflicts. In the midst of this instability, various tribal groups began moving through Macedonia, Thessaly, and into southern Greece, including the group later known as the Dorans. Their presence in southern Greece correlates closely with the fall of Mycenaean cities, has led some researchers to ask if a number of Dorans or other Balkan factions have joined arms with the sea. People are helping to push a huge armed exodus across the Mediterranean. Archaeological clues, interesting suggestions. New layers of post-collapse settlement in the Peloponnese reveal abrupt shifts in tour architecture, burial practices, and pottery types suggest a culture separate from earlier Armenian traditions. Similarly, near the Levantine coast, various pottery kinds and construction techniques emerge that bear features connected with the Balkans or northern Greece. While this evidence is not sufficient to clearly confirm that Dorian directly participated in the Sea Peoples, the date is obviously suggestive. Perhaps most interestingly, the emergence of ancient DNA studies has contributed new instruments to this. Scientists are already investigating ancient relics from Greece, the Balkans, and the Levant. As preliminary findings, the data imply that during the transition after the Bronze Age collapse, there was an increase in genetic markers connected to Balkan groups in southern Greece, and several coastal Levantine villages as well. Offers the possibility that migrating Balkan populations not only penetrated southern Greece, but may have joined. Seaborne migrations are becoming part of the Sea Peoples wave that is so significant. However, as with any theory, there are crucial counterpoints. First, the Dorans, according to later Greek legend, regained control in southern Greece following the collapse. Rather than, if a large number of Dorans had converted into Sea Peoples, a substantial cultural presence in later Greek history may not be as obvious. The Sea Peoples were a diverse coalition, assigning the Balkans a dominating role risks, oversimplifying a phenomenon that obviously comprised populations from Anatolia, Iran, and the Levant. Beyond, finally, while genetic research has immense promise, there are too few ancient DNA samples to establish solid conclusions regarding the magnitude, despite the premise of migration, the position of Balkan people within the Sea Peoples, the presence of tribes from the Balkans, particularly the Dorian, plays a vital dimension to our understanding, reminding us that the Sea Peoples phenomenon was not a simple one, linear event, but the outcome of several overlapping migrations that interact in varied ways. And it is precisely this complexity that makes the tale of the Sea Peoples so strange, varied, and eternally interesting, a conundrum we are still trying to piece together today. After weighing the various theories and the idea of displaced Mycenaeans' migrations from the Balkans, many modern researchers have concluded what is likely the most plausible conclusion of all. The Sea Peoples were not a single, united ethnicity, nor a permanent, long-standing partnership. They were probably a transient coalition created from several different groups, each with their own aims, swept up in the swirling crises of the era. First, as evidenced by Egyptian archives, particularly the Medinet style, in the Medinet Habu reliefs, the Sea Peoples are listed as a collection of exceedingly different groups. Sharon Shipeliset, Giz Denian, Luca. None of these groups had a well-documented homeland in Egyptian literature. Their military customs, attire, and equipment also varied greatly. Many researchers questioned why the Sea Peoples were a cohesive country. Are their portrayals and descriptions so diverse from one another? The most reasonable argument is that the Sea Peoples were likely a loose confederation created amid the larger regional collapse. In a world where harsh climate change causes widespread agricultural failures and earthquakes have devastated towns, international trade collapsed, powerful empires weakened, and lost control over. Countless groups of displaced farmers, unemployed military, pirates, and desperate migrant gangs may have joined forces to form mixed, mobile populations traveling across the Mediterranean. In this process, loose alliances, these groupings most likely emerged out of pure necessity. Those with better strength or naval experience might take leadership roles, while others joined in pursuit of new land's wealth or just survival. This would explain why in large campaigns, such as the conflicts during the reign of Ramesses III, the Sea Peoples brought not only warriors, but also women, children, animals, and wagons full of belongings. They were not simply pirates. However, armed migratory groups have relocation as one of their ultimate goals. Additionally, archaeological evidence, the Levant demonstrates that the cultural traces of the Sea Peoples were highly. Some sites exhibit substantial Aean influence, whereas others are Anatolian. Others are a combination of local traditions, which further supports the belief that Sea Peoples were not a homogeneous block, but rather the product of various wandering peoples and forces uniting amid the bustle of the period. This theory captures the genuine volatile nature of the age, when the old world order fell and palace systems failed to defend their citizens. Individuals had few options but to move, and in a period of turbulence, military strength became a key means of survival. Thus, from a patchwork among disparate factions, a loose Sea Peoples coalition evolved as a fighting force, part refugee flood. Seeking someplace to endure, such a partnership could disintegrate upon reaching new regions or evolving as conditions changed, which helps explain why their historical traces appear so scattered and elusive. This is why many researchers today view the idea of a brief hybrid alliance as the most plausible and suitable explanation, as well as the enigma of the Sea Peoples continue to reject any ultimate easy solution. Despite all possibilities, the most intriguing aspect of the rising of the Sea Peoples is the one that focuses on the climate catastrophe, because it provides insight not only into the Sea Peoples themselves, but into an overall Earth was disintegrating at its very foundations. Modern climate studies combine ice core, analysis of tree rings, lake sediment records, and pollen evidence suggests that during the late 13th and 12th centuries BC, the Mediterranean and near the east had a prolonged and severe drought. These drought cycles could have lasted ranging from 50 to 150 years, profoundly affecting the rain-dependent sediment cores from numerous agricultural systems in the Levant. Revealed rainfall declined, resulting in significant decreases in wheat and barley. In Anatolia, tree ring examinations on old pines reveal years of stunted growth as a clear indicator of recurring crop failures. Meanwhile, in locations like the Aegean and Balkans have harsh, steep terrain and scarce fertile soil, food shortages would have gotten much worse as the climate deteriorated against the backdrop of society that had long relied on trade networks and centralized palaces. Economies began to lose their stability as food grew scarce, and prices skyrocketed. As public dissatisfaction escalated, the lower levels of society were pushed to desperation with little options left. Several communities were forced to depart their homelands, joining waves of migrating through a world where most of the previous political structure had already fallen, and where the remaining fertile lands were now concentrated in dispersed coastal cities or river valleys. Conflict was almost over. Furthermore, in such an unpredictable world, isolated migratory groups cannot easily defend themselves. Many resorted to band together, establishing armed coalitions capable of protecting members and taking resources from destitute farming communities to unemployed soldiers, and these nomadic peoples formed coalitions that became known as the Sea Peoples, began to take shape. In this perspective, the Sea Peoples were not the primary cause of the collapse, but rather, however, as these migrating groups traveled over the region, and their very presence exacerbated the already ongoing collapse. Cities were devastated. Farmers were forced away from their farms as trade lines were disrupted, resulting in a vicious cycle of violence and displacement. Archaeological data substantially supports this interpretation. Layers in cities like Ugarit, Mycenae, and Pios correspond closely with the known In the Levant, new people arise in the archaeological record at precisely the time of an extended drought, when palace networks and trade systems were collapsing. Numerous researchers today, many believe that the combination of climatic crisis and violent migration was probably the single most potent driver behind the Sea Peoples phenomena. A world that had relied on climate stability and trade success, once robbed of those pillars, may not help, but fall into waves of violence and migration. Spiral. The Sea Peoples were neither pure villains nor simply victims, but the most apparent example of an era coming undone. But the deeper we dig, the saga of the Sea Peoples, the more we come up against what could be the greatest. We don't really know where they are. Across hundreds of clay tablets, innumerable reliefs, and there is not a single line in the written archives of ancient civilizations that clearly speaks of a country. Sea Peoples. No nation is identified, and no king ever calls himself king of the. No map from the era marks the territory of Sheridan, the king of the Pelisaid. These groupings, why is that part of the rationale, resides in the very nature of the extant historical sources, which primarily originate from the Egyptians, who Egypt was one of the few big nations who fought against Sea Peoples. Civilizations to survive, the Sea People storm unscathed, and the Egyptians had every inscription, every thief, and relief was intended to glorify the pharaoh's victories and sustain the immortal image of royal strength. Method of recording adversaries were always represented as primitive and stateless, illegitimate. When waves of anarchy crash against the order maintained by Pharaoh, even the way the Sea Peoples are enumerated in Egyptian writings illustrates this. Approach group names are offered with ambiguous adjectives, such as from the sea, from foreign areas without precise geographical references or directions, markers. This may very well reflect the Egyptians' own lack of actual knowledge regarding the origins of various clans. It could also have been deliberate propaganda that obscured the enemy's identity while exaggerating the perceived power of the pharaoh. Furthermore, the Sea Peoples themselves were not centralized empires with extensive administrative systems. They were informal coalitions of numerous groups, many of whom were migrants, climate refugees, or displaced communities, left no writing systems behind. Temples chronicling their history, no royal records. Nothing remains of them, only via the records of those who opposed them. And as every historian knows, history is written by the victors. Thus, almost what we know about the Sea Peoples now comes from the Egyptian lens. A biased lens created for political goals and occasionally prone to exaggerate the pharaoh's achievements. Adding to this, various districts from the Sea Peoples may have originated the Anatolian shores, the Aegean. Several western islands were devastated during the Bronze Age. Many cities were burned down and never rebuilt. Older writing traditions vanished the possible sources of first-hand history from the homelands of the Sea Peoples just did not survive. This mixture of the Egyptian bias in historical record-keeping and the paucity of records from marine peoples themselves have left us with a nearly impassable gap in our comprehension. Even though the Sea Peoples actually shocked the complete in the Mediterranean environment of their day, they remain and may always be shadows. The memory of humanity is a curious wave from the past, whose echo we can still hear, but we may never truly understand their genuine shape. The ancient country of the Sea Peoples remains an unsolved mystery. Their post-collapse travels left much clearer traces on the historical map. One of the most striking examples is the development of the Philistines, who, according to archaeological evidence, were intimately related to the Pelisaid, one of the primary contingents of the Sea Peoples. As evidenced by the reliefs at Medinet Habu, the Pelisaid had a significant part in the. After being defeated by Ramesses III, a portion of the Pelisaid force did not. Instead of returning to the sea, they settled along Canaan's coastline. The distinctive Philistine culture arose through a lengthy process of adaptation and integration. Archaeology would impact the political and cultural environment of the Levant for millennia to come. Excavations in cities like Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath, Ashkelon, for example, provides clear evidence of this change. Archaeological layers suggest a new habitation horizon that appears around 1200 BCE is precisely the time when the Sea Peoples are known to have arrived. Archaeologists have discovered large numbers of late Minoan-style pottery as a form of ceramic that was widespread in Aean, but rare in Canaan. Prior to this period, this implies that newcomers brought their cultural traditions from across the sea at Gaza. Architecture and burial rituals indicate the presence of a community whose practices differed markedly from those of the native Canaanites. What is especially remarkable is how the early Philistines initially kept many aspects of Aegean culture is seen in their everyday products, architecture, and rituals. However, over time, they merged with their new habitat, establishing a unique hybrid culture. This evolution combined seafaring elements with strong local customs. This is especially visible at sites like Ashkelon and Ekron, where later Philistine pottery evolved its own unique style is no longer a mere replica of Mycenaean forms. Modern DNA study has showed that early Philistine people had genetic markers associated with Western Mediterranean origins, reinforce the theory that a segment of the Sea Peoples, notably the Peliset, played a foundational role in this community. From what began as a wave of violent migration, the Sea Peoples, some of their organizations transformed into solid communities, leaving lasting impressions on the historical record. The Philistines went on to become a significant force in the Levant, regularly warring with the Israelites. Tribes are extensively recorded in the Hebrew Bible and contribute to the region's intricate political and cultural tapestry. In this sense, despite most, the other Sea Peoples groupings either dissolved or were assimilated. The narrative of the Philistines demonstrates that the Sea Peoples did not only destroy, but they also created. And this may stand as one of the most obvious illustrations of how catastrophic catastrophes may generate wholly new orders from the ruins of the ancient. After a chunk of the Peliset area of the Sea Peoples wave settled throughout the coastal regions of Canaan, forming what would become the Philistine community. One key question has fascinated academics. Philistine material culture clearly bears the trace of Mycenaean. Modern archaeological investigations have supplied a very persuasive explanation, and in ways both startling and subtle. The most significant and thoroughly researched evidence originates from pottery in the early Philistine occupancy strata at sites like Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gaza. Archaeologists discovered a considerable volume of pottery in the manner of late Mycenaean pottery, namely Minoan. 2C is distinguished by. It features complicated geometric patterns, spirals, wavy lines, and decorations painted in red, black on a pale backdrop, a trademark of Mycenaean creativity at the dusk. During the Bronze Age, these pottery items in Canaan were not imported. Greece, they were manufactured locally, implying that the craftspeople who carried this ceramic heritage had literally relocated and were manufacturing their wares in this new land. Architecture also provides an actual movement of people, not just the diffusion of commercial items or creative impact. Archaeologists at Ekron unearthed structures with open porch designs or architectural elements with clear parallels in late Minoan residential constructions. The kilns and artisan workshops discovered there employed methods substantially to those utilized in Aean craft centers. Funerary practices give. In early Philistine burials, researchers discovered simple pit burials were occasionally accompanied by grave items that reflected Aegean tradition, in stark contrast to the customary Canaanite practices of group burials or rock-cut caves. Overall, this evidence presents a striking picture. In their early phase, Philistine culture had a strong Minoan impact seen in their ceramic building and ritual life, where the tale becomes more fascinating within 2 or 3 generations of Philistine material culture. Mycenaean Tusi pottery evolved dramatically, gradually giving way to Philistine styles are distinguished by novel shapes and colorful embellishments. Architectural forms expressed a combination of influences and local ingenuity, began adding more Levantine characteristics. Burial traditions evolved farther toward regional norms. This evolution implies that Philistines were not passive bearers of Mycenaean civilization, but actively adapted, blended and modified their cultural identity in reaction to their new environment, forming a distinctive hybrid heritage that honored their roots while acknowledging the realities of life in. Archaeologists often identify early Philistine culture circa from 1200 to 1150 BCE. Philistine Phase. Philistine II is the later phase where the Mycenaean imprint is most obvious. Philistine III marks the establishment of a distinct Philistine identity, localized and well adapted to their Levantine habitat. The Sea People's legacy extended beyond layers of ash and ruins, flowed into new cultural currents, creating permanent traces that enriched the intricate historical tapestry of the Mediterranean. And the Mycenaean legacy, Philistine culture, is one of the clearest and most fascinating testaments to that convoluted path. The traces of the Peliset, a Sea Peoples group that would become the Philistines, have been revealed. The fate of the other Sea Peoples remains unclear, despite diligent archaeological research, a lot more obscure. And this is hardly surprising, since we have seen the water. People were not a single coherent ethnic group. They were a loose coalition of dispersed tribes and peoples, each with it had its own roots, identities, and objectives. And as the Great Bronze Age catastrophe arrived, many of these groups would eventually come to an end if they were not destroyed in combat, assimilated with the Mediterranean communities where they settled. Generations, their distinct identities would have largely dissolved. Names once rang forth from Egyptian inscriptions, Iran Shilesh, Checha, Denian Luca, vanish from the historical record. But this does not imply that these persons gone completely. It is significantly more likely that survivors of these groups incorporated into local civilizations, either in the areas they had attacked or in. Consider a few examples of where they eventually settled. The Sharonme. Some experts believe they have established themselves in the Western Mediterranean, contributed to Sardinian warrior culture, where the great stone towers. Nurag is still standing today, silent witnesses to an ancient era of upheaval. The Shechesh, whose name refers to Sicily, may have similarly integrated into the island's original communities. Distinctive character is fading into the growing Sicilian society. The checker left, arguably, the archaeologists found the tiniest indication at the Dor site, and on Israel's current seashore, have unearthed a layer of occupancy with cultural components not totally Canaanite. This may represent the existence of Czech settlers, but in time, the local, the Dinian, may have been tied to the Dawi, a name for the Mycenaean Greeks most likely reintegrated into the larger Greek world during their post-collapse migrations and difficult resettlements of Greece's so-called Dark. The looser of the Lycian region of Anatolia may have integrated back into the Anatolian highland communities, remaining under new names, social structures no longer tied to the Sea People's identity, recorded by the Egyptians. The trend in these events is the same. After the storm of history had passed, Mediterranean civilizations began to stabilize. The fragmented Sea People's groupings could not sustain separate identities for a long time without official governance, their own recorded traditions, and without strong cultural institutions to preserve their identity throughout centuries. Assimilation was inevitable, and when it did, names like Sharon, Shalish, and Checa disappeared, leaving only faint echoes on Egyptian stele, persisting as tantalizing questions for future historians. We are not merely reading layers of ash and ruins, but also the legacy of the Sea Peoples, are also understanding combined lineages and cultural identities that silently altered Mediterranean civilizations from within, which could explain why, even after almost 3,000 years, the mystery of the Sea Peoples continues to intrigue historians and archaeologists alike. They symbolize a surge of history that cannot be simply pinned down as a force of human mobility. Change, its effects and legacies are subtly integrated within the very fabric of Mediterranean history. Thus, after tracing every footprint, every layer of ash, and every remaining fragment, we may begin to see why the Sea Peoples become one of the biggest mysteries of the ancient world. Their impact is readily obvious in the archaeological record. Strata among the ruins of fallen cities and lost civilizations. Records for Egyptian inscriptions, strata of material in Canaan. the Levant, and the Ion tells portions of their narrative. But perhaps this is what makes the mystery so convincing. The more evidence we unearth, the more we understand that what we know is simply the visible tip of a massive, submerged iceberg. First and foremost, the roots of the Sea Peoples. For almost a century, researchers have attempted to trace the roots of each group: Peliset Philistines, Sharon, Sardinia, Shchesh, Sicily, Denian, Mycenaean, Danawi Chesha, Luca portions of Anatolia. However, no single theory has proven strong enough to attain general accord. Even in Egyptian documents, Sea Peoples are constantly described as waves of invaders from the sea, foreign lands having no nation, no recognized kings, and no recorded capital. Towns. This made them one of the most mysterious, incomprehensible opponents that antiquity. Second, the Sea Peoples did not leave any written history. There is no Sea Peoples Chronicle, and no stealer proudly recounts it. There are no surviving manuscripts that chronicle the account of their victories. Everything we know comes from the other side. From Egyptian documents, archaeological remains from the ruins of civilizations they struck, subsequently vanished from. This assures that their image remains permanently half visible. We cannot determine with certainty how strong they were, how many there were, how organized they were, or even if they were a single coordinated force, or numerous waves of migration, superimposed atop. Third, while the Sea People have an unmistakable impact, their material legacy is difficult to track. They contributed to or accelerated the collapse of many Bronze Age civilizations. The Hittites fell, the Mycenaeans were decimated. Ugarit burnt many Canaanite cities that were conquered. However, after the wave had passed, most marine groups either merged, joined local society, or vanished into memory. They left behind layers of ash, early ceramic styles with Aeon influences, but no lasting new. The Sea Peoples were a civilization whose tale is similar to that of a giant tsunami crashed across history, leaving severe wounds in its wake. But the wave itself disintegrating before anyone could adequately record it, and perhaps it is. This elusiveness is what makes the Sea Peoples so eternally interesting. There are several stories about strong empires with palaces and documented chronicles. However, the narrative of the Sea Peoples is the story of outsiders to official history, desperate and resolute, groups whose own voices were never saved, but who still impacted the course of an entire age. The Sea Peoples' murky character will most certainly continue to challenge scholars' imaginations and patience of all of us for many generations to come. But perhaps throughout this entire voyage to understanding the Sea Peoples, the most important question is not who they were, but how history has or has not remembered them. For without Egyptian inscriptions, we would have never known that a wave of Sea Peoples had shook the ancient globe. Everything we know about them comes from Egyptian records, in the Manpa stele, from the carvings at the Medinet Habu temple under Ramesses III. The names Peliset, Sheridan, Shalish, and Cheka originate from these inscriptions. The images of Danian Luca are preserved in these reliefs, warriors with horned helmets and round shields, as well as migratory families and women. Children and livestock are moving as part of this tremendous upheaval. Without these records, the layers of ash at Ugarit, Mycenae, the new settlement levels in Canaan, would have stayed separated, making it impossible to connect into a coherent image of such a massive wave of armed migration. This also reminds us of an important truth. History is written by the victors. Egypt, as one of the few great civilizations to survive the storm of the Sea Peoples, documented this account. Pharaoh is always shown as a triumphant hero in the inscriptions. The Sea Peoples, the barbarian invaders who have been defeated, have no voice. There is no record of the Sea Peoples' stories, as seen through the eyes of those who were compelled to quit their homelands, cross the sea in despair, and strive to survive. This is what makes the narrative of the Sea Peoples so fascinating and sobering, because what remains in the historical record is always simply one side of a much broader tale. If one day a chronicle of the Sea Peoples would be uncovered, provided one had ever been written, the story we know today may appear very different. However, that account does not exist. The Sea Peoples were naturally migratory communities, without a robust administrative framework and a long-term documentation system. They are among the lost voices of history. This is a broader lesson. How many events, how many individuals, how many stories once shook the ancient globe, but never one recorded them from their side, and we will never know they existed in the sea. People, whether by fortune or disaster, left just enough marks in Egyptian stone for today we can trace their tale. But there are probably many other sea peoples. Long human stories have been consumed in total quiet, leaving behind nothing but layers of soil and stone. And perhaps this is what makes the mystery of the sea peoples everlasting, intriguing, because it's a story about how history is documented, how human memory is kept, and how many voices have been forgotten along the way. And when our trip reaches the last lines of the story of the Sea Peoples, perhaps an even bigger question lingers in the mind. If not for the inscriptions, Egypt, we might not have known that the Sea Peoples existed. So how many other chapters of human history, how many towns, civilizations, and stories have been utterly erased from humanity's memories? The layers of Earth we discover today show just the written documents that have survived, are the voices of the few civilizations that managed to retain their heritage. Behind every carved stone and broken piece of every line etched into temple walls represents a huge ocean of things, unknown as and perhaps unknowable. And this is why the path of exploring history never truly ends. History is. The Sea Peoples provide not only what we know, but also what has been forgotten, buried, or never documented at all. One of the most vivid examples of this was the nameless wave that changed the political, economic, and cultural map of the entire Mediterranean, but whose identity has all but vanished into the sands of time. Yet they are not the only ones of the sea. People can shake an entire age, but we still don't know who they are. How many other stories have been utterly lost, leaving no trace? The written records we now possess may be someplace in a distant land, under layers of earth still to be excavated. Clues remain hidden, fragments that could forever affect the way we interpret the past, and possibly via interactions. Through every film and narrative we tell, we can help keep these questions alive, ensuring that history is preserved, not a closed book, but a constantly open portal to new discoveries. If you, too, believe there is still much we don't know about the past, if you want to continue this voyage of researching hidden histories and unsolved riddles, feel free to subscribe to the channel. It will be your means of staying connected with the adventures ahead, to stories that may just change the way you perceive the human tale, because this voyage and the history it explores will never truly come to an end.